Welcome to another episode of the Victory Over Vices podcast, brought to you commercial-free by addictionhelp.com. I am your host, Dan Hauser, and on today's episode, we're going to take a look at the correlation between food and athletes, specifically unhealthy eating habits, and how those can turn into eating disorders. Let's get right into the show. All right, so before we bring our guest on for this episode, just a quick little background as far as how this topic came up, how this episode kind of came to be. The idea for this one actually came about when I was listening to a recent episode of Pablo Torre Finds Out, which, if you're a sports fan, which I assume you are since you are listening to us here as a sports show, you guys absolutely should be checking that podcast out if you haven't already. But so on this particular episode that I was listening to, Pablo Torre, who's the host of the show, had Mike Golick Jr. on to talk about linemen and football and kind of what they go through not to hit that weight that they need to in order to play it. You know, Mike Golick Jr., former lineman himself, he kind of shared some of his behind-the-scenes secrets, if you will, as far as things that he did to pack on weight when he went from high school to Notre Dame in order to play lineman there at Notre Dame. And so, he talked about weightlifting. Obviously, that's part of bulking up, but also a lot of that has to do with food and eating, and not just eating, but eating a lot. And so, you look at somebody like a Mike Golick Jr. now compared to when he was playing, or even Jeff Saturday is another name that comes to mind. You look at Jeff Saturday now on ESPN versus Jeff Saturday when he was playing for the Colts. They're two completely different human beings. You know, they have to be a certain weight and a certain size to be able to be a lineman in the NFL. And then after they retire, in the cases, specifically those two, but in oftentimes cases as well, they drop a lot of that weight and they return to a weight that's more healthy and more what they should be for their body size as a normal person and not an athlete. And so, like we like to often do on this show, we took that kind of topic idea and I wanted to expound upon it, and I wanted to take it deeper, and I wanted to look at it beyond just what an offensive lineman or defensive lineman would have to do. And it's just athletes as a whole. It's no secret that athletes have specific dietary and nutritional regimens that they abide by. You know, for example, look at Tom Brady. The guy's never had a strawberry a day in his life. You know, that might just be a weird thing, but as athletes, they do often have weird things, and nutrition is no exception. But beyond that, I also wanted to find out if there's a correlation between maybe some of those oddities or idiosyncrasies when it comes to their nutrition, and even if continuing to have unhealthy relationships with food can delve into potentially something more severe and something worse, such as an eating disorder. And so when we come back, we are going to take a deeper look into that. We're going to try to answer some of those questions and take a look at that relationship with athletes and food, and as well as the potential for eating disorders with Dr. Natalie Klag, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at The Ohio State University. So we'll be right back. All right, welcome back to the show. As I teased in the introduction, I am joined once again on this episode by Dr. Natalie Klag, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at The Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. Natalie, thank you so much for coming on with us again.
For sure. Always happy to be here.
So this is what, your third time now on, so I guess it's official. We can call you a friend of the program now.
There we go, yes.
A show regular, if you will. But as you know, and as I talked about a little in the introduction, kind of today's topic of discussion is athletes, food, nutrition, unhealthy eating habits and whatnot. I mean, it all kind of lumps in with athletes these days, especially as nutrition becomes more and more important in their daily lives. So we got a lot of topics, a lot of questions I want to ask you. So let's just jump right into it. Starting on a more positive note, if we look at kind of some of the ways athletes view nutrition these days compared to how maybe they did, 30, 40 years ago or whatnot, or even maybe 20 years ago, what are some of the key nutritional requirements, some of the key nutritional things these days that athletes tend to lean on, tend to look for, especially given all the physical demands and the way we now have a better understanding of how our bodies work at that level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I think we're seeing a time where athletes are more willing to talk about caloric intake. They're seeing calories as a positive thing, a way to get energy, not something negative, something that's, we should avoid at all costs. So we have to remember that calories aren't inherently bad. I think that's a mind shift for a lot of us. And I think athletes are starting to see that as well. With athletes, they really want to focus on getting a good balance of all of the good nutritional items. So things like carbs, proteins, and fats. It's all about the balance and also good fiber, all the stuff that keeps our guts healthy. Another big thing that athletes have really brought to the attention is the importance of hydration. There have been a lot of studies that show the hydration status of an athlete is one of the biggest factors that play into their performance. So they've shown that even a 2% decrease in hydration level can cause challenges with performance. So I think that's a big part of what they're focusing on. And so I think as time has passed, we've seen, feeding the body what it needs, giving good quality nutrition has been more of the focus, less so than how many calories are you getting? What fat are you eating? Are you eating whole grain versus processed foods? It's more about how do you feed your body and give it that holistic nutrition now. So I think that's a really good shift that we're seeing.
Really quick before we continue, just so put everyone's mind at ease. Yes, that is a fire alarm in the background. No, I am not putting Natalie in danger by having her on right now. That is just simply a fire drill, fire test. They're testing the alarms in her building at the moment. So don't worry, everyone. She's not going to burn up in the middle of the show here. We're all good. But
we've never heard so many fire alarms here. Yeah. It's strange.
I mean, given where you're located, you are in the medical center there. It's probably good to know that the fire alarm is operational.
Yes.
There, we want to keep everyone safe,
for sure,
especially there in the medical center there. Yeah. So. Pivoting back now to this. So part of what inspired me to do this episode, and I touched a little on the intro, Mike Golick Jr., who played offensive lineman for Notre Dame, was on a recent podcast episode, and he was kind of talking about what he went through to bulk up between high school and college as far as being a lineman and the amount of food he had to eat and what exactly he had to eat. And so that kind of what brought on the idea to do this show today. And so along those lines, so you look at, say, even within the same sport, but you look at, say, an offensive lineman and they have to weigh a certain weight and look a certain way or whatnot. And then you look at, say, a wide receiver who has to be quick, agile, more lean. And then, of course, outside of football, if you compare, say, an offensive lineman to a gymnast or a swimmer or runner, whatever it is, obviously every athlete, depending on what they need to be able to do to perform, is going to have a different diet, so to say. And so, how exactly, beyond just the caloric intake number, how do those diets differ based on kind of what you need to be able to do?
Yeah. So, weight maintenance is tricky. We've all heard of the 2,000 calorie diet, but the number of calories, the amount you have to intake to maintain weight is going to be different depending on what your weight is, right? So people who are trying to maintain a larger body size are going to have to eat more in order to maintain that body weight. But then within different sports, we're seeing kind of the focus of what their energy needs to be and what kind of power it needs to give them impacting, their diets. So for example, if the sport relies on a short burst of energy, really high power, but for a really short amount of time, then they want to focus on, it's called the phosphagen system. It's what gives that really quick, really strong energy. Whereas for players say playing a football game where they need to have energy for a full hour, it's more focusing on things like their oxidative energy system. So things like oxidative energy is the burning of fat. So they have to have that fat reserve. So for the players who are playing, football, or even thinking a basketball game where they have to run for an extended period of time, they need to have that reserve. So they have to eat foods that are going to build up that fat reserve for them to be able to burn. Whereas someone who's maybe, say, a sprinter needs to focus on how do I access energy quickly? So that's going to change what they need to eat in order to get the right type of energy and power for the sport that they're playing. So it kind of goes into what body size do they need to maintain, but also how do they need to be able to use the energy?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You mentioned the 2,000 calorie intake number too. So Michael Phelps, very famously, when he was when he was winning golds at so easily for all those years. He very famously talked about his daily caloric intake, his daily diet. It was filled with a lot of fast food, a lot of junk food, a lot of high calorie stuff. And obviously he looked the way he did. Now, if I were to eat that daily diet, I would not look like that. So 2-part question. 1, how does somebody like that be able to eat like that and be able to then still look the way he did? And also, when you eat that way and you put that many calories into your system, first off, like, is it healthy, really? I mean, it obviously works for them, but is it healthy? And also, what does it do to your insides when you eat that way?
Oh, the insides. So, like, yes, having a high calorie diet is something that many of us would love to be able to do and look the way that Michael Phelps does, but is not realistic. But, the high calorie diet isn't necessarily inherently unhealthy because, again, calories, when we think of them as just a unit of energy, someone like Michael Phelps, who's training for how many hours a day doing very intense physical activity that the rest of us aren't doing, he's going to burn that energy. He needs that energy because if not, his body is going to start to break down other important things, his muscle, things like that, to get the energy that it needs. He's going to keep training whether his body has the energy from food or not. So keeping his calories high allows him to have the energy to do something like that. So I think when we think of, a high calorie diet, like what he talked about, it's more thinking about, is it going to get utilized? And for people like elite athletes who exercise for hours and hours and hours on end, it's okay because they're getting the energy that they need. But we also have to think about like what's part of that high calorie diet. So, you're going to have lots of grease if you're eating a lot of fast food. So it means you're going to have a risk of increasing your cholesterol. You're going to have a higher sodium intake. So making sure, yes, the calories are important, but like those other things aren't great for your body. Those other things aren't super healthy. So, it comes with risks. It's going to increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. It's going to increase the strain on your kidneys to process all that salt. So, good for Michael Phelps that he's young and his body could accommodate it, but I wouldn't recommend such a particular diet. But, thinking like long term for athletes who eat that kind of diet and, get in the habit of just swinging through and grabbing a burger and fries, like that's okay when you're expending that energy. But once you're not, that's going to catch up really fast. And so, figuring out what the change in energy use is going to be really important for athletes so that they don't have like long-term health problems once they stop that intense level of exercise.
So, and we see it a lot, we talked about how offensive linemen or linemen in football, they are so big compared to what they would be if they weren't playing football when they're playing. And then they stop playing and they often drop the weight and they return to what looks like a more healthy, normal weight for a normal person. But on the reverse side of that too, you'll sometimes see with some of these, maybe basketball players or baseball players, they stop playing and they go the opposite way. They may balloon up or put on more weight because they're not required to diet or eat in certain ways anymore. So mentally, like what kind of happens in the brain both ways when athletes retire, whether it's they retire and lose a bunch of weight because they had to be almost overweight while they were playing, or they start putting on weight because they're not required to eat as carefully anymore.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of it is about, the balance between that energy level and the dietary consumption. And so it's hard to know how many calories you're burning on a day-to-day basis. So, someone who isn't used to having maybe more of a sedentary lifestyle, not working out extensively on a day-to-day basis, it's going to be hard for them to figure out exactly what type of diet is going to match what they need. But, the idea of having to change the way you think about food is really hard, right? Because we're humans. We need food. We have to interact with food. We can't avoid it. That's part of what makes nutrition, eating a really delicate subject because we can't avoid it. So for these athletes who have had a very strict relationship with food, when they have to change it, for some people, it can be very liberating where they get to finally like feed their body what it needs and what it wants in order to like be the body size that they want. But for some people, it does become this like question of like, is this what my body's supposed to be? Is this how I'm supposed to interact with food? So it can get very confusing and be very distressing for people. So, you know, when we see these body changes, I think oftentimes they get praised, you know, typical culture where we like to comment on people's body size. You know, I think we need to think more about like, is the person feeding their body what it needs rather than, you know, manipulating it in a way to meet the athletic need?
So what would you say then are some of the biggest myths when it comes to athletes and their diets? Like some of the things that people assume are the case that may not always necessarily be true.
Sure. So one of the things that always makes me laugh, one of the myths I love is like the Gatorade myth. Like you see the Gatorade commercials where like people are just like walking around with Gatorade. And I love Gatorade. I'm not here to knock it. Please don't be mad at us. But you know, it's this idea of like, you're just always drinking Gatorade. Like Gatorade's great. It's super great if you have expended a lot of energy, you need to replenish your electrolytes, but like on a day-to-day regular basis, you probably shouldn't be drinking only Gatorade. So there's also the idea that coconut water is an acceptable replacement for Gatorade. That's also not true. That's one of those like new myths of like, oh, you don't want the sugar from Gatorade, use coconut water, and that's not true. There's also the idea that like lean is equivalent to like speed or quickness, and like being lean and being skinny doesn't actually make someone fast. Speed is more related to the power that they can exert. So I think this idea of like, oh, well, if I just got skinny, I'd be able to be fast is a big myth that I see, you know, from like some of these athletes. The idea of carb loading before your event competition, that's not super helpful. It's more about long-term nutrition. Like, yes, there's some validity to eating a high carb diet before an event, but like not having good nutrition and then suddenly eating like a bowl of pasta before you go run a marathon is not going to be helpful. And then like superfoods. I looked up like, what are superfoods for athletics? And like the things that listed are pretty much anything. If you can imagine any food, it was probably listed on some list. So those are things to be skeptical about. The idea with all of these, the big overarching theme is like, oh, one food is going to make me athletic. Doing this one dietary thing is going to make me an elite athlete, and I'm going to have this stellar performance. And it's really like the big way to bust all of them is say like, it's about long-term healthy nutrition, maintaining your body, giving it what it needs, not taking one split moment to try to like make up for multiple days of not so positive, healthy dietary decisions.
It's funny, the speed one you mentioned too. For anyone out there who wants to see that theory that you have to be tiny to be fast debunked with your own two eyes, go watch the combine and watch these linemen run their 40s. And I guarantee you that, and I can't speak for everyone because I don't know everyone's situation out there, but I know for a fact that those linemen are running faster 40s than I could ever dream of running in my life. And obviously you can tell just from look, I am not as big as these linemen, and they are running incredibly fast 40s for their size. So yeah, it doesn't always necessarily mean that you have to be small to be fast. I'm glad you brought that one up because no matter how often I see it, it still blows my mind when I watch these linemen run those 40s, and I'm like, wait a minute, somebody of that size shouldn't be able to run that fast. But once again, if you treat your body right and you're good enough at it, you can sometimes defy science and defy logic and put up speeds like that. So.
Right. They've got those legs that could move a semi truck, and that's going to get them going a lot faster.
And if you think about it, that's basically what they're doing every play when they're trying to push a defensive lineman or on the defensive side of the offensive lineman out of the way. You're essentially trying to move like a truck, basically on every play. That's your goal, is to try to move a very large person in a direction that you want them to go. So,
sure. Yeah.
So moving, you touched on the superfoods one already too, which is good because that was going to be my next follow-up question, but we already hit that, which is great because that superfoods one, I looked that up too because you always hear superfoods and I'm like, what exactly is a superfood? But
it was wild. It was wild. You could literally, you could just stand in the produce section and pick something up and be like, this is probably a superfood.
Superfood, yeah. So obviously a big point of contention in sports is performance enhancing substances. We've talked about that on previous episodes. When we talked about marijuana on that last time you were on, we talked about how it could be deemed a performance enhancing drug and whatnot. So along those lines, could athlete's certain diet or certain things that he or she eats, could that be considered a performance enhancer? And I mean, obviously it's not a drug, but could you say that by them choosing to abide by a certain diet, it is a performance enhancer because it makes them allows them to perform better?
So I think if we think about it in terms of like just purely taking the words for their pure meaning of like what could enhance their performance, sure. I think the idea that, if you feed your body what it needs, if you're eating things that align with who you are genetically, things that, are specific to you, yes, it's going to make your performance better. But I think when we think about performance enhancement in terms of like sports, I often think of things that would give you like an unfair advantage that maybe other people don't have. And I think, when we think about elite athletics, I want to be specific about that. People who have the financial access to positive nutritional options, I think the playing field's probably pretty level with that. So, I think in that respect, I don't necessarily see it as performance enhancement that could give one person a leg over another, because I think they all have the same opportunity to make those like good dietary choices. Now, when we're talking like, think maybe high school, and you have kids who are maybe from a more privileged background versus more of an underserved background, kids who are from a food desert where they're not able to get those things, I do think in that way, we might be getting more into like performance enhancement. But again, it's a little bit tricky. Just thinking, unfair advantage, just purely from a body sense. Now, one thing I do think when you start to get into like the supplement world, when you have some of these athletes who are using supplements to supplement their nutrition, I think that's where things get a little bit dicey, because like what's actually in supplements, we don't know, big question mark, not regulated. So I think in that respect, there could be some performance enhancement issues that we would want to worry about. But I think just purely from a food nutrition standpoint, it can give them a performance leg, but I don't think it's an unfair advantage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. So, and you brought up something interesting point where you're talking about the professional level where these athletes have the means to whether they hire their own nutritionist, or a lot of these professional sports teams have access to nutritionists available for these athletes. When you get into the high school, and even specifically because of where you're at the college level, a lot of these athletes at the college level, they may not come from backgrounds that will allow them to have the best nutrition, say when they were growing up. So they almost have to learn when they get to college how to properly balance nutrition, what's better for them to eat than others. Specifically for you all at Ohio State, because obviously, I mean, you're a very major Division I institution, very good athletic programs. Obviously, it's very top of the line. You're at the top of the college level. What are some things that you guys that specifically at Ohio State do to kind of help almost teach these kids proper nutrition, especially the ones, like we said, that may have come in that weren't able to learn about that, in their younger years?
Yeah. So, sometimes I know a lot of our athletes have access to like specific food halls where they can get food that might be more nutritionally based. Now, that being said, I've definitely seen some videos where they're getting chocolate chip pancakes. So to each their own. But I think a lot of it is like here we have like a really rigorous nutrition department where we can get them in touch with that, making sure that they know those things. But I mean, it's tough when you're on a college campus and it's these all you can eat food halls where it's just like, yeah, I would love to have 3 plates full of French fries. So we also understand like college kids are college kids and they're going to kind of eat what they want to eat. But, I know we do have like a very involved nutrition department here that tries to offer that information to those who are interested in learning it.
Oh, of course. I mean, absolutely. You can, what's the saying? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So, yep. I mean, it's nice to at least be able to have those options
exactly.
Available. So certain sports, specifically boxing, wrestling, mixed martial arts, those sports, they set their matchups based on weight classes.
Mm-hmm.
And for anyone that has is followed or is a fan of boxing or MMA, specifically the UFC, it's no secret what these athletes go through as far as weight cutting to reach their weight that they have to be to compete. Because just like we talked about, in many cases, the weight that they need to be at for their competition is not a healthy weight that their body should be at on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are at their natural healthy weight, for their entire year or whatever, lead up to the fight. Mm-hmm. And then usually in those last couple of days beforehand, they undergo extreme measures to cut sometimes as much as 20 pounds in maybe 2 to 3 days. And so it's no secret that it's really unhealthy. It's no secret at this point that it's incredibly dangerous. I don't think that anyone out there thinks that it's okay anymore. I think that if you asked even the most hardcore of boxing or MMA fans, they would tell you, yeah, that's really awful and it's a really bad thing to do. So my question is, why is that still allowed? Why do these organizations still allow weight cutting to be a thing that has to happen?
Yeah, I think, nutrition is something that's an ever-growing field of study. I think part of the problem is it's hard to know what else to measure. Weight is a really easy metric to get. It gives the illusion of equality. Obviously, we know that two people that weigh the same are not made the same and might not be an equal match. But I think it comes down to what else would we measure? What else would we look at? Do we look at body fat? Do we look at muscle mass? So I think it's been an easy metric to measure. We haven't known different for all that long relative time. But I think it comes down to what else would they measure? And so I think it's just been this way, which I hate the answer of it's always been this way. So that's how it is. But I think because it's been that way, and at this point, people still do it.
Yeah.
So I think that makes it tough.
So I guess my other question would be, are there things that can be done to cut? Obviously, I don't think you can completely eliminate cutting weight for these types of competitions unless you were to just say, we no longer are doing this by weight classes anymore, which I don't think will ever happen. So for those out there that may be just getting into mixed martial arts or boxing, that maybe it's not so ingrained in them that they think it's the only way, are there safer ways for cutting weight than maybe the extreme measures that these athletes are currently doing? Because like you said, that's just what we've always done. Are there safer alternatives out there that maybe we could encourage people to do instead of just, basically sleeping in a I don't know, those things that look like there's those silver things that you can just cut weight, that. That's obviously incredibly unhealthy.
Right. So I think some of it comes from a mindset shift. And I understand that the lower weight class, maybe you'd have an edge. I get all those things. But I think really it's just focusing on you have to put your body first, right? It's helping athletes understand that while the sport is very important and you want to be as competitive as you can while you're playing the sport, the decisions that you're making during this time of your life are going to have long-term lasting effects on your health. These are going to be behaviors and mindsets that you get stuck in if you aren't careful. And so I think just encouraging these young athletes to prioritize their own health and safety over their athletic performance and saying if you're feeding your body appropriately and this is the weight that you should be at, then this is the weight class you should be at, and I know that's a whole mindset shift for the whole sport, but I think it's more focusing on putting people in a healthy place and understanding that keeping them healthy is what's going to make them most competitive.
So it's pretty common, especially even more so now in today's society, athletes endorsing or being sponsored by whether they're fast food companies, candy bar companies, typical quote unquote junk food. I mean, Michael Jordan famously had the "Want to be like Mike," McDonald's commercials. LeBron James has done McDonald's commercials and whatnot. Do these athletes, in your opinion, have more of a responsibility as far as being the spokespeople or advertising, these unhealthy foods? Because somebody at home might be saying, oh, well, LeBron James is is on a commercial for McDonald's. That must mean that I can go get McDonald's now and it'll be okay. And I don't know if that's an exact thought that somebody has, but it might be, or just the fact that they're associating themselves with these quote unquote junk food brands. I guess, yeah. Do they have a responsibility to I guess not promote bad food? I don't know. That's
sure. Yeah, I think, obviously, I think from the eye of the media viewer, I think we have to be critical and say, like, do we really think that the athlete is eating the food that they're advertising for? And
that was going to be my other thing too. Like, right. Do we really think LeBron is eating that Big Mac? Like,
probably not. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe he loves Big Macs. It's hard to say. But I think one thing, a lot of these commercials really, honestly, truly, I think they associate it more with like coolness, like being cool and being popular and being liked, rather than like the actual nutritional value of the food, right? Like, none of these guys are doing these commercials and saying like, eat McDonald's, it's very healthy for you. And again, McDonald's, please don't be mad at us. But like, I think it's more like here, go get McDonald's with your friends and you'll be cool and you'll have a Taco Bell in your house. So I think it's more like that's more what they're advertising. And I think like at the end of the day, like who they advertise for and what they want to advertise for is on them. But I think it's more from our perspective, I think it's more working with the idea of like good food versus bad food, right? Like to have McDonald's occasionally is fine for anybody. And so I think we just have to have that mindset shift of like good food versus bad food. Just feed your body what it needs. Who cares what LeBron is eating? Now, if we're talking about like, again, superfoods, I think that's like a whole different thing. And like that I would be much more critical of. But I think at the end of the day, like we just have to realize these people are probably not eating what they're advertising for.
I mean, listen, so, you're saying the quiet part out loud there. I think we can all agree on that. So I want to take a shift here and look at some of the unhealthy side of some of these athletes' relationships when it comes to dieting and nutrition and food and whatnot. Eating disorders immediately come to mind as far as, when you talk about athletes having to be so restrictive and so conscious of what they're eating, it's only natural that it can mess with them mentally. It can mess with their psyche and make them think that there may be things wrong that aren't necessarily there. Or the reverse of that, you can overeat or think you need to eat more than you really need to. And so that's a long-winded way of asking the question, how common are eating disorders among athletes? And then beyond just that, are there certain sports where we see eating disorders happening at a higher rate than others?
Sure. So thinking about eating disorders, so the terms often get used interchangeably, but so there's disordered eating and there's eating disorders. And so I think a lot of times, especially in the media, those get used as the same thing, and they're not exactly the same thing. They're similar, they have similar characteristics, but eating disorders are more pervasive. They have a bigger effect, like impact on the person's health, on their like interaction with the world. And so I think it's important to know that if they're talking about, oh, this person has disordered eating, they may actually have an eating disorder. And so I think just not downplaying the severity of it. So the statistics tell us that up to 20% of males in athletics have eating disorders, and between 6 and 45% of females have a diagnosed eating disorder. Now, I want to bring up that the statistics for eating disorders are typically very underreported. So my guess is those numbers are actually much larger than we see. Sports that are considered lean sports, so things like distance running, dancing, gymnastics, where we think of more that lean body type, have higher rates of eating disorders for women, whereas weight classes like we talked about, those are more commonly associated with eating disorders for men.
So we talked about kind of some common myths and misconceptions earlier when it came to nutrition. I do want to point this out too. I think a lot of people, when they hear the term eating disorder, I think their minds automatically go to something like anorexia or bulimia, which, yes, those obviously are eating disorders, and those are very severe ones. But that's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what is considered an eating disorder. So maybe if you just kind of want to share a little bit with the audience some of the other
Sure.
maybe common eating disorders that could occur amongst athletes that people might not even think would be a defined eating disorder.
Yeah, so anorexia nervosa is typically a pattern of restricted eating. So that's where you don't let yourself eat, you eat very minimal amounts. And that's to change the way your body is. So bulimia is where you intake food and then somehow get rid of it, whether that's through vomiting, the use of laxatives, extreme exercise. There's also like binge eating disorder. So that's where people eat a large amount of food all at once. And typically feel a lot of shame about it. There's a lot of embarrassment. It would be a lot more than what would typically be eaten in the same amount of time. There's like restrictive eating where people might only eat like a very small amount, like type of food. So those are really the big things that we see in the athletes.
Female athletes tend to develop eating disorders at a disproportionate number to men. Beyond just that disproportionate number, how might a male athlete experience an eating disorder compared to how a female may experience it, both physically and mentally?
Sure. So, I think, again, we live in a world where people love to make comments on people's body types. And I think females often bear the brunt of like being subjected to like leanness and skinniness comments, whereas men often get the comments about like muscle, having like the fitness body. So I think, what they're expected to look like is different. And I think for men, there's often that like internal shame that leads to it being super underreported in males. Men, I think, often hide any issues with eating disorders. It's seen as like a very feminine female issue because men aren't supposed to worry about what they look like and they're not supposed to care. And, for these people, it might not be physical appearance that they're worried about, right? It's making sure that they're the correct body type for their sport. But I think it's often seen as a very feminine issue. So I think there's a lot of shame associated with it for men, in just a very different way than for females.
And so beyond just that, what kind of impact can eating disorders have on an athlete, not just performance-wise, but also their overall health, short-term and long-term?
Sure. So in females, one of the things that we look for is called the female athlete triad. It's a big sign of an eating disorder, not appropriate nutrition. So it's when we see disordered eating, amenorrhea, and osteoporosis, especially in young women when they have really fragile bones. That's like a really big red flag. So we see that, in young females or males who are having like purging behavior, we would see that they would have like teeth erosion. They'd have sores on their hands potentially for making themselves vomit. They would have swollen glands. They might be taking laxatives, so they're putting a lot of stress and strain on their GI system. So, I think we see these what seem like short-term issues leading to long-term problems. This can lead to impaired cardiovascular conductivity. So like issues with like heart arrhythmias. It can lead to electrolyte imbalances, which can put you at risk for things like seizures, again, other cardiac problems. It can cause GI damage where people are vomiting. It can cause erosion of like the esophagus, which could be very dangerous. Long-term, you can have anemia. You can have reproductive issues. People often have very chronic constipation issues. So, these things seem very short term. Often they think, oh, I'm just going to do this for a short amount of time, which is like totally a myth with eating disorders. But it does lead to some really long-term health consequences that are a struggle for many, many years.
Are there early warning signs that people can kind of be on the lookout for, to whether it's a coach or a teammate or a family member, that may indicate that somebody is struggling or heading down the path of what could ultimately end up being a development of an eating disorder, so they may be able to kind of step in and help or intervene?
Sure. People with eating disorders are really good at hiding them. So it takes a really keen eye to see them when they're starting. So if you're seeing someone who's having very restricted eating patterns, maybe they're wanting to eat in secret, not wanting to eat around other people. If you're seeing, the athlete triad that we talked about, that's important, especially if you're like part of the medical staff for the team. Those would be things that you might know about. If they are very disproportionately afraid of gaining or losing weight, to the point where it's like causing emotional distress that's disproportionate to what you would expect, that's a sign. Females who restrict, it's less common in males, but it can happen in both. They have something called lanugo. It's a very fine hair that can start to cover their body. And it's essentially to try to help regulate temperature, because when people have eating disorders, they have a lot of trouble with temperature regulation. So we see that fine hair start to crop up. It's the same hair that we see on like newborn babies. So it's pretty distinct, honestly. You know, it's just a lot of it is like the secrecy around food that should be like a huge red flag.
And then for those who may be battling an eating disorder or maybe struggling when it comes to their relationship with food, what are some of the options out there for them, whether it be treatments, support groups? What can they do to kind of break away from it, if you will, and try to get the help that they need?
Yeah. So anyone who's struggling with an eating disorder, it is profoundly challenging, again, because we have to have food, right? Like you can't just get rid of it. Like people who are dealing with like a substance use issue, you can't just stay away from it. Like we have to have food. So it's very psychologically challenging. So number one, biggest, most important thing, if you or somebody you know is struggling with an eating disorder, medical stabilization is number one. You have to make sure that the electrolytes are balanced. You want to make sure that there's no risk of something called refeeding syndrome. So getting medical stabilization is primary priority, because everything else won't matter if they're medically ill. Some people who struggle with eating disorders need intensive residential treatments. They need to go somewhere where they're going to stay and have very focused treatment for a period of time. The big main type of treatment for eating disorders is CBT. And then the other component of that is family therapy, involving family and support, people who are close to them, their primary support system, getting them involved to make sure that they can work with the individual to try to help facilitate meals, make sure that things are moving in a positive direction. A lot of nutritional education, make sure they understand why it's important to feed their bodies. And then really the big thing is understanding that this is kind of a lifelong struggle. Like this isn't something that you can just deal with once, do the treatment, and then it's going to go away. Like this is something that's going to continue to be an ongoing issue that needs to be monitored, addressed, worked with for a while.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So along those lines, as far as, it's something you have to continue to work on. So, an athlete who is recovering or in recovery from an eating disorder, like you mentioned, it's not like they can just like stop eating.
Right.
And beyond that, they still have to maintain their proper diet and nutritional requirements in order to be able to stay successful in their sport. What are some things that athletes can do who are recovering from an eating disorder? What are some things that they can do to maintain the levels that they need to be at to be able to perform, while also kind of reintroducing themselves to their food in a more healthier way again?
Yeah. So I think with that, the biggest thing is rallying your supports, right? Like making sure that you have people who are going to hold you accountable, people who are going to be able to offer you the insight, because a big part of eating disorders is this distorted body image. It's looking in the mirror and seeing something that's different than the reality that's there. So you need people who are going to be able to tell you what the reality is when you start to question that. And unfortunately, I think, eating disorders can be so heavily triggered. It doesn't take a lot to kind of drive somebody into those old habits. So I think for some people, it's understanding that the sport might be too triggering in the long term, which is really unfortunate. and really devastating for some folks. But, when we think about eating disorders, things like anorexia has the highest morbidity of any psychiatric illness. 5% of those who are diagnosed with an eating disorder with anorexia die within 5 years, and 1 in 5 of those are by suicide. So it's really important to know that, if someone is dealing with anorexia, many of the other eating disorders have similar, long-term issues. But, knowing that while the sport is important, it may be too triggering, and having people around them to rally that support and really give them the love that they need to get through that transition in life, I think is really the big important thing.
So whether it be at the team level, the league level, or even above that, are there things that these organizations can be doing to not necessarily prevent it? Because I don't know if it's something you can prevent, but at least provide the education to these athletes to at least help them better understand the severity of these eating disorders and the development of them?
Yeah, so I think, having these sports have a de-emphasis on being thin or dieting to win your competition, making sure that there's less of that focus. I think having trained healthcare professionals on the team available who can focus on nutrition would be really helpful. Like we've talked about with weight class based sports, if we could figure out another way to measure like equal competition, I think that would be a huge step. I have no solutions, but somebody out there could come up with one, I'm sure. I think having coaches and staff be educated on what to look for to be able to identify early signs. Because again, you might not be able to stop it, but identification early is so important for eating disorders. Then I think the other thing is a united front on guidelines on how to manage these things. Right now there's not any sort of guidelines for the athletic world about if someone's dealing with an eating disorder or recovering from an eating disorder, when they can return. What level of nutrition do they need to be at before they can get back to competition safely? And so I think if there was a way to more objectively measure those things, to be able to say when someone's ready to return, if they're safe to return, I think that would be a huge step in a positive direction as well.
One last question here we'll get you out on. So we often like to talk about when it comes to all sorts of mental health conditions, addiction issues, breaking the stigma, so to say, making it more acceptable to admit that their issue is there, to seek the help that you need. Whether it be, the ideal athletic body that so many people have in their mindset about, or athletes just in general being kind of the last ones to admit that they have a problem with anything, not just with eating, but with anything involving their lives. What would you say is maybe the biggest thing that we all can do as a society as a whole to kind of break this stigma when it comes to eating disorders and kind of allow for more positive acceptance, so people feel more comfortable not just admitting to it, but then also getting the help that they need?
Yeah, I think honestly, as with any of the other things that you mentioned, it's talking about it. It's being open about it. It's sharing your struggles, being raw and vulnerable about it. I think, when it happens in secret, when it happens behind closed doors, everybody thinks they're isolated. Everybody thinks I'm the only one struggling with this. This is a me problem. It's not a world problem. And that's so far from the truth. But until somebody's brave enough to stand up and say like, hey, I struggle with this, like it's so isolating and people just feel a lot of shame. And so, having people who are brave enough to say, hey, this is a problem. I'm struggling with this. Is anybody else dealing with this? I think it's hard to bring it into the light, but once it is, it's like a floodgate. And then it's like, oh yeah, I struggle with that too. So I think it's having a safe platform where people can share about these things and not have a fear of punishment, be able to receive the resources that they need, not have things taken from them because they share these struggles, I think is really the big thing. And, from the common person who's watching sports, it's, saying like, I support this person. And you know what, if they decide that their relationship with the sport that I so love them for has to be over so they can be healthy, it's respecting them as a person rather than just as an athlete.
Well, Dr. Natalie Klag, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at The Ohio State University, thank you so much for coming on and sharing some incredibly valuable information about not just athletes and nutrition, but the unfortunate, unhealthy side of this all as well.
Of course, happy to be here. Always fun.
All right, that'll do it for today's show. Thank you once again to Dr. Natalie Klag for joining me. If you liked what you heard today, please continue to like it, subscribe, rate, review to our show. Please continue to share these episodes with your friends, family member, and loved ones. And it's been a while since I brought this one up, but please send in your questions too. If you guys have any questions about any of these episodes we've done, if you guys have any topics that you would love for me to touch on a future episode, I'd be happy to do it. Obviously, we want you guys to continue to enjoy the product that we put out. So please continue to send those questions in, those comments in, those topic ideas in as well too, and we will make sure to share those on the show or do an episode on them or whatever we can do to make sure that those requests get answered. And so really quick as well, I like to do this at the end of every show, just a friendly reminder, especially with today's topic of conversation about unhealthy relationships with food and eating disorders. It is if you or someone you know is struggling, whether that be with an eating disorder, another mental health condition, a substance abuse issue, please go get help. Please go do what you need to get yourself the help that you need. It is okay not to be okay, but it's also okay to seek help so that you can be happy, you can be healthy, and you can enjoy your life to the fullest. So if you are not sure where to get started when it comes to the process of getting the help that you need, addictionhelp.com is a great resource website for all information you may need. It's got great information on things like eating disorders and other conditions. There's also resource pages as far as helping you to begin the process of getting the help that you need. So please go ahead and check them out there over at addictionhelp.com. That will do it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you guys later. Have a good one, everybody.